I loved what Demian Maia brought to the game. And let me explain that a little bit. In my opinion, Demian Maia is one of the last true specialists. Now, when you look back at the beginning of MMA, or the UFC, let's say that. When you look back at maybe MMA in general, but whatever. The UFC for sure. When you look back at the beginning of the UFC, it all started as a competition about which style of martial arts was the best. Okay, when you look back at the, I forget which Gracie it was, but it was a Gracie who was teaching out of his garage. He's teaching Brazilian Jiu Jitsu out of his garage, and one of his students comes to him and says, hey, I'm also taking something else like Taekwondo. My Taekwondo instructor says that, your Jiu Jitsu isn't any good in a real fight and that he would win. And the Gracie says, we'll tell him to come on over. We'll fight. That'll determine which style is the best, which martial art is superior. So they come over, they have a fight, he ends up winning, right, the Gracie. And this continues to happen over and over and over until finally he ends up getting in touch with a promoter, or a promoter approaches him. They end up coming with the idea of the UFC. One thing leads to another, and here we are, right? Obviously there was a lot going on in the middle there, but my point is it was ultimately started as a competition between two styles. So in the beginning, you saw people come in who were specialists in their styles, whether it was somebody with Taekwondo, Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, boxing, wrestling, shoot fighting, whatever it was. You saw people come in, they were specialists, and they weren't really that well versed in much of anything else. And that's how it all started. And then before you know it, you started to see people who would blend one or two styles together. And then you have it, and it's already evolved into what we have today, where the young guys coming into the game are started out training everything from day one, right? Right out the gate from day one, they started training everything. Maybe when they were like a child, little kid, they took some karate, they took a little Taekwondo. But by the time they hit teenage years, like, it was available to train at an actual MMA gym where you can train everything together, right? Wrestling, jiu-jitsu, boxing, Muay Thai, all of those things. They're all there, and they're available for you. Well, Demian Maia was the last of the old breed, right? He was the last guy who came in as a specialist. He was just a hardcore jiu-jitsu guy, right? Won a bunch of world titles, Abu Dhabi, all kinds of stuff. Just a wizard on the mat. So he comes over, and that's primarily his game. Takedowns weren't that great at first. Stand-up was horrific. Oh, man, go back and watch some of those old UFC, some of his first UFC fights. His stand-up was horrible. But his submission game was, especially at that time, people had not seen the level that he was at. I mean, he went out there and he was doing things to guys that people had just not seen before. They weren't ready for it. They were getting submitted in no time flat. I mean, Chael Sonnen, watch what happens. And it was like UFC 95 or something, where he's fighting Chael Sonnen. Watch how fast he goes in there and submits Chael Sonnen. Makes it look easy. Does it like it's no problem at all. Chael Sonnen was a D1 wrestler. Right, Olympic alternate. Goes in there, nothing, no problem. Right, and I mean, I remember a little bit later in his career, I loved the fight with Rick Story where he took his back, got him in the neck crank, couldn't get his arm right, so he had his back, had the body lock on, but he couldn't get his arm, couldn't sink the choke in. Right, he was trying to get the strangle with the rear naked choke, trying to get that arm underneath, couldn't get his forearm underneath the neck. So instead, he just goes across the face, turns it into a neck crank, goes right across, and just cranks it so hard that his nose popped. Just blood everywhere. Just turned on like a faucet, man. Oh, it was crazy. But I mean, that just shows the kind of squeeze that guy had. Or that, he probably still has, but he's getting up there now. He's like 43 or 44 or something. But, man, I loved what he brought to the game. His jiu-jitsu was so pure, and it showed guys what was really possible in a lot of ways, right? Because traditional jiu-jitsu, you train with a gi on, and there's a lot of moves that you can get away with when you have a gi and your opponent's wearing a gi that you can't do in an MMA fight because you're just out there with a pair of shorts on, right? You don't have a lapel to grab, no collar. You can't grab at the sleeve. You can't try to manipulate his balance by grabbing his pants at the hip or something. You can't, grab the inside of your sleeve to attempt to tighten up on a hold, right? So you have to do everything different in MMA. I mean, that was the basis behind why 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu started, right, with Eddie Bravo. It was all about no-gi competition, but not just no-gi, but also particularly MMA and fighting off of your back and stuff. So he had to really take his jiu-jitsu, and he talked about it in some of his early interviews. He had to take his jiu-jitsu and his art and he had to adapt it to MMA, because back then there wasn't a whole bunch of it going on, and especially not a guy who was as accomplished as he was in jiu-jitsu. I mean, he was up there. I mean, you had guys like, the Nogueira brothers and stuff, but it was rare. It was rare. And he came out there and he did it at such a high level, so efficiently, so beautiful. And like I said, he was the last of a dying breed. He was the last of a specialist. So wasn't always the most entertaining to watch, particularly that fight with Anderson Silva. Might blame Anderson Silva more for that one. Striking all the way up until in the very end, right? His striking, it still wasn't great, right? You look at Demian Maia all the way up into these last fights, it's like his striking still wasn't special. He worked on it a lot, and you saw it progress over time. But ultimately, everybody knew what his bread and butter was. He was going to go in there. He developed his takedowns a lot, actually. He was going to go in there. He was going to try to take you down, and he was going to try to get your back and submit you. He was a back specialist on top of it, So it is what it is. But man, I really enjoyed watching him. I really enjoyed the art and the level of dedication and perfection that he brought to the game. It was entertaining to watch. So if this ends up being his last fight, I'm not sure if he announced that he was going to have his retirement, that he was going to retire or anything like that. But you have to figure if it's not going to be now, it's right around the corner, right? I mean, he gets knocked out in this fight. He's like 43, 44 years old. He was already debating it, I think, before the Ben Askren fight, which there's another notch in his belt. He went out there and he got Ben Askren to retire, right? he was the one to put him out. But man, yeah, if it's not now, it's going to be sometime soon. So, big shout out to him. Really enjoyed watching him. Really enjoyed what he brought to the game and everything that had helped teach future generations, for them to be able to take little pieces from, grab, adapt, develop, use for their own. So a big shout out to Demian Maia. Wish him well in whatever he does next. It was a pleasure watching him work.